The photograph was never meant to be seen. It sat in a dusty medical archive in West Virginia for over 70 years, filed under a case number instead of a name. When the file was finally opened in 2003, the researcher who found it had to leave the room. Not because of what the picture showed, though that was disturbing enough, but because of what was written on the back in faded pencil. Patient believes child is divine punishment, refuses to name father, says it was God's will. Her name was Loretta June Whitaker, though almost no one called her that. In the hollow where she was born in 1939, they called her the Whitaker girl, and later, after what happened, they called her nothing at all. They stopped saying her name out loud, as if silence could undo what everyone had seen. But the medical records don't lie. The genetic testing done decades later doesn't lie, and the truth, once you see it, doesn't let you look away. This is the story of a girl born into a family that had been marrying itself for so long that the bloodline had begun to collapse inward like a dying star. A girl whose own child would become a medical case study in what happens when the human body tries to build itself from genetic instructions that have been copied and recopied so many times. Blueprint itself has started to disintegrate. This isn't folklore. This isn't exaggeration. This is what actually happened in the mountains of Appalachia when isolation, poverty, and something darker than either created a family that existed outside the normal rules of human biology. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. The Whitaker family had been in those mountains since before West Virginia was even a state. They'd arrived sometime in the 1700s, settled in a hollow so deep and isolated that even the census takers stopped trying to reach them after 1910. The dirt roads didn't connect to anything. The nearest town was 12 miles away through forest, so thick you could walk for an hour and never see the sky. In winter, they were completely cut off. In summer, they simply chose not to leave. By the time Loretta was born, the family had been intermarrying for at least 5 generations, maybe more. The records get murky after 1870, but what's clear is that the Whitaker name appears on both sides of nearly every birth certificate. Cousins married cousins, uncles married nieces, and when the gene pool got too small even for that, the pattern went deeper. Brothers and sisters, fathers and daughters, the kind of thing that doesn't get written down in family Bibles, but that everyone in the hollow understood without speaking. Loretta's own parents were first cousins, both of them born to siblings who had themselves been the children of a brother and sister union 1 generation back. If you drew her family tree, it wouldn't branch outward like a normal tree. It would fold in on itself. Names appearing over and over in different positions. The same genetic information recycling through the bloodline like a photocopy of a photocopy, losing clarity with each iteration. She was born with a cleft palate and eyes that didn't quite focus in the same direction. Her left hand had 6 fingers. By the time she was 5, it was clear she would never be like other children. She learned to walk late, talk later. The teachers at the one-room schoolhouse 3 miles down the mountain tried for a while, but eventually they stopped expecting her to come. Her mother kept her close after that, kept her in the cabin, away from the eyes of strangers who passed through selling goods or preaching gospel, away from questions. But isolation doesn't protect you when the danger is already inside the walls. When the thing you're supposed to fear most is already sitting across from you at the dinner table, already sleeping in the room next door. Loretta was 14 years old when her body started to change in ways that terrified her. She didn't understand what was happening. No one had explained it to her. Her mother noticed first the way Loretta's dresses didn't fit anymore, the way she got sick every morning and couldn't keep food down. By the time winter came in 1953, there was no hiding it anymore. Loretta was pregnant. The family didn't call a doctor. They didn't tell the preacher who came through twice a year to perform marriages and baptisms. They certainly didn't tell anyone in town. Instead, they did what the Whitakers had always done when something shameful happened. They pulled inward. They closed ranks. They pretended the world outside the hollow didn't exist and couldn't judge them for what happened within it. When people finally started asking questions, Loretta's mother told them the girl had been touched by a drifter who'd come through looking for work. A stranger, someone who'd moved on before anyone could catch him. The story was thin, and everyone knew it. But it gave the family something to hide behind, a lie that was easier to accept than the truth. But Loretta herself wouldn't say anything. Not to her mother, not to her aunts who came to check on her, not to anyone. The few times someone pressed her about who the father was, she would look down at her swollen belly and whisper the same phrase over and over. God's will. It's God's will, as if divine intervention could explain what human depravity had caused. As if calling it holy could make it less obscene. The pregnancy was difficult. Loretta's body, already weakened by generations of inbreeding, wasn't built for this. She was small, malnourished, her bones still growing themselves. The baby inside her was taking everything she had. By her third trimester, she could barely walk. Her teeth had started falling out. Her hair came out in clumps. She looked like she was dying from the inside, and in a way, she was. Her body was cannibalizing itself to build another life. A life that was already doomed before it ever took its first breath. When the labor started in March of 1954, it lasted almost 2 full days. There was no hospital, no doctor, just her mother and an aunt who delivered babies before, working by lamplight in a cabin that smelled like blood and fear and something darker that no one wanted to name. The baby was born just before dawn on a morning, so cold the water in the wash basin had frozen solid. It came out silent, no cry, no movement. For a moment the women thought it was stillborn, and perhaps that would have been a mercy. But then it gasped a wet, rattling sound, and they saw what they were dealing with. The infant was tiny, barely 5 lb, with skin so translucent you could see the veins beneath like a road map of broken highways. Its head was misshapen. The skull plates fused incorrectly, bulging on one side and flattened on the other. The eyes were too far apart, set at angles that made it clear they would never work together. One ear was missing entirely. The other was just a small hole in the side of its head. Its hands were twisted inward, the fingers webbed together in places. And the feet, what should have been feet, were clubs of malformed bone and tissue that would never bear weight. But it was the spine that made Loretta's mother turn away and cross herself. The baby's back had never fully closed. You could see the spinal cord through a gap in the flesh, covered only by a thin membrane that pulsed with each struggling breath. The medical term is spina bifida, but the women in that room didn't know that term. They only knew they were looking at something that shouldn't exist, something that nature itself had tried to prevent from being born. Loretta reached for the baby. Anyway, her mother tried to stop her, but Loretta pulled into her chest and held it there. This broken thing she'd carried, this consequence she didn't understand. She tried to nurse it, but it couldn't latch. Its mouth wouldn't work right. After a few minutes, it stopped breathing altogether. just went still in her arms as if it had only been waiting for permission to stop fighting. They buried it the same day before the ground thawed in an unmarked spot behind the cabin where the family had been burying its mistakes for generations. No name, no ceremony. Loretta's mother told her it was better this way, that God had seen fit to take it back, that it was a mercy. But Loretta didn't speak for 3 months after that. She just stared at the wall and rocked herself and whispered things no one could quite make out. It was a traveling nurse who finally broke the silence. Her name was Dorothy Hendress, and she'd been hired by the state to do wellness checks in the most isolated parts of Appalachia, places where children were born and died without ever appearing in any official record. She'd heard rumors about the Whitaker family, the kind of whispers that got quieter when she asked direct questions. But in May of 1954, someone finally told her the truth. Told her about the girl, about the baby, about what everyone suspected. But nobody wanted to say out loud. Dorothy hiked up to the hollow on a Tuesday morning with her medical bag and a county sheriff who didn't want to be there. What she found was worse than she'd imagined. Loretta was sitting on the porch, vacant-eyed and skeletal, looking more like a ghost than a girl of 15. Her mother stood in the doorway, arms crossed, daring Dorothy to ask questions she had no right to ask. But Dorothy had seen enough. The missing teeth, the malnourishment, the way Loretta flinched when her mother moved too quickly, the way the other family members watched from the windows like animals protecting a den. Dorothy tried to talk to Loretta alone, but the girl who wouldn't speak, wouldn't even look at her. So Dorothy did the only thing she could. She filed a report with the county, described what she'd seen, recommended immediate intervention, suggested that Loretta be removed from the home and examined by a proper doctor. The report sat on a desk for 6 weeks before anyone looked at it, and when they finally did, the decision came back stamped in red ink. Insufficient evidence for removal. Family has rights. Case closed. That should have been the end of it. In most stories, that's where it would end, with bureaucracy winning, with a girl disappearing back into the mountains with silence swallowing the truth. But Dorothy Hendress didn't let it go. She kept coming back, kept checking on Loretta, kept documenting what she saw. And in 1956, when Loretta became pregnant again, Dorothy was the one who finally got the authorities to act. This time, there was no story about drifters, no excuses. The family physician who examined Loretta, a doctor who'd been practicing in those mountains for 30 years and thought he'd seen everything, took one look at her medical history and knew exactly what was happening. He saw the genetic markers, the skeletal deformities that only appear in cases of extreme inbreeding, the cognitive delays, the pattern that couldn't be explained any other way. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? The doctor's report was 8 pages long, written in the careful language of a man who knew he was documenting something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He described Loretta's condition in clinical terms, the bone malformations that develop, mental delays, the clear signs of what he called genetic collapse. But it was the final paragraph that changed everything. In it, he stated plainly what everyone had suspected, but no one had been willing to put in writing. Patient shows unmistakable signs of multigenerational consanguinity. Current pregnancy likely result of incestuous relationship within immediate family. Recommend immediate intervention and criminal investigation. The state finally acted in August of 1956. They removed Loretta from the home and placed her in a facility 3 counties away, a place that was half hospital, half asylum, where girls like her were sent to disappear from public view. Family fought it at first, threatened legal action, but they had no money for lawyers and no standing in a community that had already begun whispering about them. By the time the case went before a judge, the Whitakers had gone silent. They stopped coming to town, stopped answering questions. They retreated even deeper into their hollow, and the county was happy to let them vanish. Loretta gave birth to her second child in February of 1957. This baby lived that was almost worse. It survived for 3 years in that facility, never learning to walk or speak or recognize faces. The medical records describe seizures, blindness, profound intellectual disability, and physical deformities so severe that the staff had to design special equipment just to keep the child comfortable. When it finally died of pneumonia in 1960, Loretta wasn't told for 2 weeks. When they finally informed her, she didn't react at all. She just nodded as if she'd already known, as if some part of her had felt it the moment the child stopped breathing. The state tried to investigate the family. After that, they sent social workers into the hollow, tried to interview other family members, attempted to build a criminal case. But by then, the Whitakers had learned how to make themselves invisible. They wouldn't talk to outsiders. They had no phones, no official addresses, no paper trail to follow. The few neighbors who might have testified suddenly couldn't remember anything specific. And without Loretta's testimony, without her naming anyone, there was no case to prosecute. So the state did what it often did with problems it couldn't solve. It institutionalized them. Loretta spent the rest of her life in that facility. She never went home, never saw her family again. She existed in a kind of legal and social limbo, a ward of the state who'd been forgotten by everyone except the nurses who changed her bedding and the doctors who updated her file once a year with the same notes, no change. Patient remains none. Verbal and unresponsive. Loretta June Whitaker died in 1983 at the age of 44. The cause of death was listed as heart failure, but the truth was more complicated than that. Her body had simply given up. Decades of malnutrition, genetic damage, and the kind of trauma that destroys you from the inside had finally caught up with her. She died alone in a room that smelled like disinfectant and old flowers, surrounded by people who knew her face but never knew her story. They buried her in the facility cemetery under a small stone marker with just her name and dates. No family came to the funeral. No one claimed her belongings. A few dresses, a Bible she couldn't read, and a small cloth doll she'd kept clutched in her hands for over 20 years. But her story didn't die with her. In the early 2000s, when genetic researchers began studying isolated populations in Appalachia, they stumbled across the Whitaker case files. What they found stunned them. Loretta's DNA told a story of inbreeding so extreme it pushed the boundaries of what scientists believed was survivable. The genetic diversity in her genome was comparable to that of laboratory mice that had been deliberately inbred for research purposes over dozens of generations. In simple terms, her parents were so closely related that she had the genetic variation of someone whose family tree had been collapsing in on itself for over a century. The researchers tried to trace the Whitaker family further to understand how this had happened, but the trail went cold. The hollow where they'd lived had been abandoned sometime in the 1970s. The cabins had collapsed or been reclaimed by forest. The few Whitas who remained had scattered to other counties, other states, shedding the family name like a poisoned coat. Some of them probably walk among us today, carrying those damaged genes forward into new families, new bloodlines, the genetic consequences of their ancestors' choices, coded into their very cells. There's a small historical society in West Virginia that keeps Loretta's file now, stored alongside other difficult stories the state would rather forget. If you ask to see it, they'll warn you first. They'll tell you it's disturbing. They'll ask if you're sure you want to know. Because once you see those photographs, once you read those medical reports, once you understand what was done to that girl in the name of family loyalty and mountain isolation, you can't unknow it. You can't pretend it didn't happen. You can't tell yourself that these things are just folklore or exaggeration or mistakes from a less enlightened time. The truth is that Loretta June Whitaker was a victim long before she was ever born. She was the inevitable result of a family that had been victimizing itself for generations. Each marriage pulling the bloodline tighter, each birth gambling with genetic disaster, each generation hoping that somehow they'd be the exception to the rules of biology. She never had a chance, neither did her children. They were born into a tragedy that had been building for over 100 years. Each generation laying another brick in a prison they didn't even know they were constructing. The mountains of Appalachia hold thousands of stories. Most of them are beautiful tales of resilience and community, and people surviving against impossible odds. But some stories are different. Some stories are warnings. They're reminders that isolation can be dangerous, that secrets can poison bloodlines, that sometimes the worst monsters aren't the ones hiding in the forest. They're the ones sitting at your dinner table, and they've been there so long that everyone's forgotten they're monsters at all. Loretta never got to tell her story in her own words. She never got justice. She never got the chance to be anything other than a cautionary tale in a medical textbook. But maybe that's why her story matters. Because somewhere out there in another isolated community, in another family that's kept its secrets too long, there might be another girl who needs someone to see her, to recognize what's happening. Before it's too late to break the silence, before it kills her, too. If this story disturbed you, good. It should. And if you're thinking about it tonight when you're trying to fall asleep, if you're wondering how many other Lorettas are out there right now, then maybe, just maybe, that discomfort will turn into something useful. Maybe it'll turn into awareness. Maybe it'll turn into action. Because the only thing worse than knowing these stories is pretending they never happened at you.